Welcome to today's Zoom into Soil webinar. I'm Sarah Gary, Executive Officer of the British Society of Soil Science, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our third webinar of this year. Today's event is co-organised by the British Society of Soil Science and the Ecological Continuity Trust. And before I welcome our panellists, I'd just like to introduce you to the British Society of Soil Science. We're an established international membership organisation and charity committed to the study of soil in its widest aspects. And we bring together those working within academia, and we have a growing membership amongst practitioners implementing soil science in industry and those with a keen interest in soils. And this year we're running 8 Zoom into Soil webinars, with the next one taking place on Wednesday, the 6th of April, with a focus on peatlands of Scotland. That will be supported by Visit Britain and Nature Scot. And the webinar will also look ahead to the World Congress of Soil Science, which we're hosting in Glasgow between the 31st of July and the 5th of August. As I mentioned, today's event has been organised in collaboration with the Ecological Continuity Trust, and I'd like to welcome Ben Sykes, who's their Executive Director, to give a brief introduction to ECT before our webinar begins. Thanks for joining us today, Ben, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. You're very welcome, and it's a pleasure to be partnering with the BSSS in this webinar. The Ecological Continuity Trust was established in 2008 and is unique in being the only registered charity in the UK, at least, entirely dedicated to preserving, maintaining and promoting the UK's long-term ecological field experiments. Many of these are decades long, and in a couple of cases have been running continuously for over a century, for example at Parkgrass in Hertfordshire and Pallasleys in Northumberland. Our UK-wide register covers all 4 home nations of the UK and comprises over 70 long-term experiments at different stages of their life cycles, and 36 of those are currently actively undergoing experimental treatments. Part of ECT's role also involves helping to get the data from these experiments out to end users, where they find impacts in biodiversity improvement, understanding and mitigating the effects of climate change, sustainable land use, and, dare I say it, horticulture. We shall see when Jill speaks later, who looks after the Thursley Common long-term experiment in Surrey that is also a part of ECT's National Register of Sites. One of the activities ECT has been pursuing in recent months is trying to attract the soil science community to long-term ecological experimental sites as a research resource. Many of these experiments sit above soils that have lain undisturbed for decades, but obviously subject to continuous above-ground manipulations. We therefore think they're an attractive proposition for soil science research, linking above and below ground. And we hope that this webinar will help with that thinking. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Ben, and we will see you a little bit later for the question and answer session. Before we begin, just some basic housekeeping then. As there are so many of you here today, all your microphones have been muted. We will be taking questions at the end of both presentations, and as I mentioned, Ben will monitor these for us. Please, could you try and submit any questions you have by 12:50 to allow us to get through as many as we can. Although there is a raise your hand button on your screen, we won't be using this unless the presenter specifically asks for a show of hands. Today's presentation has also been awarded BASIS and NROSO points. If you're registered with either body and you would like to claim your CPD points, please contact us directly after the event. And finally, please be aware that we are recording today's presentation. So without further ado, I'd now like to introduce our first presenter, John Dickinson, the Handsome Gardener. John is an Instagram sensation and has spent the last 10 years transforming gardens into beautiful flower-filled spaces that entertain and delight. John's passion for plants is only rivaled by his love of the natural world. He marries them together by creating beautiful floral vistas using sustainable principles to enhance the natural biodiversity of the garden from the ground up. So I'd like to welcome you, John, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you all today. I'm also slightly embarrassed that I'm wearing the same shirt as I was in my profile picture. It's awkward. Yes, so I'm honoured to be speaking with you, and I do thank the British Society of Soil Science and the Ecological Continuity Trust for letting me do this. I'd also like to say it's a privilege to be able to speak on the same bill as Dr. Jill Cowell, whose work in the field of mycorrhizal symbiosis is something that I'm fascinated with, and I think most gardeners, whether amateur or professional, would really benefit from learning much more about. Okay, so let's begin. Here we go. This is a picture of my garden. You can probably tell straight away my passion is herbaceous perennials and golden retrievers. That's Loxley the dog. And this was the romance period, the honeymoon period, where I didn't realize what a struggle it would be combining those two passions into one, trying to maintain a beautiful garden while having a lovable but slightly manic puppy. But we get along just fine, and we do our best, we muddle through. I want to speak to you a little bit about how I've been building gardens over the last 11 years now. It's a passion of mine. I am not a professional. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a horticulturalist. I'm not a botanist. So let me explain, while I was thinking that through, let me explain what I am and who I am, and also what message I was hoping you might be able to take away from the presentation today. When I was doing this, I realized that Baz Luhrmann's "Everybody's Free to Wear Sunscreen" did it better than I could, with a slight amendment. So if you remember the song, he introduced to a class of graduates his speech on the extolling the virtues of sunscreen. And I think we should be extolling the virtues of mulch. So if you take anything from this today, I hope it is that everybody is free to mulch, and that mulch, the long-term benefits of which have been proved by scientists. Everything else I'm going to say is the result of my meandering experience. I'll dispense this now. Okay. So I represent a group of, well, a huge group of amateur gardeners. In fact, just last year alone, we learned from the Horticultural Trade Association that there were 3 million more gardeners who had taken up the passion and the hobby since lockdown, which is hardly surprising. We're all desperate to get outside. Now, the gardens that we have in the UK, when all combined together, form a larger area than all of the nature reserves in the UK. So we have the ability to make big change if we work together. And I want to talk about how I built my garden and what I learned from the trial and error along the way, and what I might be able to share with you. So what's the first thing you do when you're presented with a blank canvas, a brand new garden? Nothing. Oh, I skipped on, sorry. Oh, I skipped on one slide too many there, apologies for that. You do nothing, you live with it. I'll try and skip back one, there we go. You live with it. So the picture you can see there was the garden that I moved into 6 years ago. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's very standard, to be honest with you, a lawn with narrow borders, but it wasn't working for me. I'd spent the previous 5 years building gardens and building up a passion for herbaceous perennials, and I knew I wanted a flower-filled wonderfest, and I didn't want a lawn. So you need to live with the garden and start to learn a bit about it first before you take any drastic action. One of the things I learned really quickly, what you can't see off the slide here, is there's a huge area of garden up to the left with a big lawn, and it's raised up about 5 feet, and at the back of that is my shed. And to get the lawnmower from my shed all the way through that area, down a gravel drive onto here, was a nightmare once a week. So I wanted rid of the lawn. So once I'd established that, rather than digging it up, I put a mulch over the top of cardboard, garden compost, leaf mold, and some well-rotted animal manure. And I let the worms do their thing. This was about May, June time, I think. No, mid-May. So it meant that I wasn't going to be doing much to the garden that year, other than getting rid of the lawn. And by doing that, by putting the mulch down, it allowed the worms to take down some of the goodness into the soil and to enrich the soil and hopefully improve the structure beneath without me taking any drastic action. Another good reason for taking your time over it is to learn a bit about the sun. That's really important when choosing your plants. That's where it is during the day and what kind of light it is, whether it's dappled shade or direct sunlight, and how it moves across the garden during the day, during the months, and even during the seasons. All of those are really important for choosing what plants you buy and where you put them. As the mantra goes, right plant, right place. You put a Mediterranean shrub in the shade, it's not going to like it. You also need to learn maybe a bit about where the water flows in your garden too. This is on a slight slope, and I learned very quickly that the bottom area was very soggy, and the top area next to the gravel there was very dry. You also might find out about weeds. There's a chance that there are perennial weeds living below the surface, and if you get straight to work, you may be chopping up bindweed and spending the rest of your life trying to get rid of it. So just give the garden time, and you'll learn a bit about it. But while you're doing that, doesn't mean you can't research. So that is Arley Hall in the background there. That's local to me, and it's where I took a lot of my inspiration from. I think there are many ways that you can take inspiration. You can look at publications like magazines, you can look online, you can go on YouTube, on social media, Pinterest. You can gather all kinds of things together without leaving your house. But none of that compares to seeing the gardens in person, to seeing how the plants interact with each other, to get a depth perspective, to visit them at different times of year, to see what's flowering and when. And Arley Hall, that first picture, does an incredible job with those herbaceous borders of having interest from the start of the season right through to the end. And that really inspired me, and I wanted to try and recreate something like that in my garden. So across the top here are some places that you can visit, all very obvious. You'll have probably visited 2 or 3 of these already yourselves. The RHS garden is fantastic. The botanic gardens like Kew are just a wealth of information as well as inspiration. And garden designers, you can look at their portfolios. All of these top ones, I would say, are the big hitters, looking for the big inspiration, and you can get a lot of information from them. The bottom ones are maybe on a smaller scale, something that you can apply a little bit more to your own garden. So if we sort them like that, those on the left, I would suggest taking lots of pictures and speaking to the gardeners there and trying to get their tips, because they will have a wealth of experience that you can learn from. Those on the right, I actually think are maybe more valuable in the long run. Things like the NGS, the National Gardens Scheme, you can go along to a local garden, short distance from your house, and you can see what grows well in your area. The gardeners are passionate, people like me who are just obsessed with gardening, not professional normally, but just obsessed with their gardens. And you'll see what grows well. You'll see what grows well in the soil. You'll see what grows well in the climate that is local to you. And that's really important. Same with local nurseries, and the same with your neighbours and your friends' houses too. And you might get free plants from them at the same time. The holidays and happy memories, I think it's a really good idea to try and incorporate something that gives you a love of the garden. So taking colour schemes from places you've visited that you've loved as a family is maybe a good start. So you've spent all that lovely time visiting nice gardens and taking photographs of plants. What do you do next? Well, you start to plan. You create your budget, you measure up, and you start to do the detail stuff. Some people will be into this, but it's for some people it's a little bit more boring, a little bit more of a chore. It's so important at this stage to measure your garden. You've just been around huge gardens, acres of gardens with beautiful flowers, beautiful plants. You've seen them all and you want them all. And you've probably got a tiny postage stamp size back garden to try and fit it all in. So measure up and then learn about the plants that you've loved that are on your short list by looking online, looking how big they grow. Map it out in scale on a piece of paper, put a piece of tracing paper over the top, and start to draw out some of those plants and see how much space they take. You'll probably end up losing about a quarter, maybe a half of the list, if you're like me. So that's your planning. And then after your planning, I think the next thing to consider is the soil. So you might never get this opportunity again. You might never have the chance to start from scratch. Once there are plants in the ground, it's a lot harder to try and work with that soil or work out what's going on beneath. So find out what's underneath there. Dig into it. I'm not suggesting digging the whole thing over, but take a spade out in a couple of different sections and have a look what's beneath. I did that, and what I discovered was a midden. I live on an old small holding, and it turns out the area I wanted to turn into this beautiful fantasy floral creation was filled with broken glass, bottles, bricks, rubble, and even a pair of false teeth, which was quite scary when I discovered that. So I was left with no choice but to riddle it. I built a big handmade sieve, and I sieved most of the soil to remove a lot of those, lot of the rubbish that was in there. In fact, I filled whole 3 gabion walls with it. But if you don't have that problem like I did, it's very good at this point to add organic matter. And my opinion on that is you don't need to dig it. Stick the organic matter on top and let the life in the soil do the work for you. Let the worms pull it down, and they can improve the soil structure and feed the soil themselves. You don't need to dig it in for them, because what you're doing when you do that is creating a massive trauma in the soil. And that's what I discovered when I did it. It created a lovely base, but it also created a trauma that took a while to recover from. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a little while. The other thing to think with the soil is that high fertility is not always necessarily the best thing. With my herbaceous perennials, they are generally quite hungry. So having a decent amount of fertility through well-rotted animal manure, for example, is a good idea. But if you're looking at Mediterranean plants, for example, you actually might want to reduce the fertility by adding in things like gravel and grit. So don't always assume that the more fertile the soil, the better. And then last but not least, the plants. Depending on what your budget is, you've got lots of options, but I didn't want to spend a fortune on the garden, and I also wanted to indulge in my passion of growing plants too. So you can start sowing seeds before you actually need to fit out the garden. So sow seeds. You can buy plug plants that are a lot cheaper than going to the garden centres. You can borrow, steal, pinch from family. One tip on that: if you're taking plants from friends or family, don't take the one they give you. Go to their garden and specifically ask for them, because if they're giving you a plant, there's a good chance they're just trying to get rid of it because it's taking over their garden. So think about that. And finally, you can often, to save a bit of money, you can often split plants. If you want to have a go at propagation, buy big plants, big pots of them from the garden centre, and then split them, pot them up individually in the early spring, and by mid-spring, early summer, you'll have a decent amount of plants rather than one. So to take a step back a second to the soil, which I talked about a little bit a second ago. When we start our gardening journey, which we all did at some point, it's very easy to forget about the soil or just view it as a medium that our plants grow in. And there's a lot of people out there doing great work now to try and raise the issue and try and educate us all on the benefits of no dig and how we can protect and enhance our soil. So when I started, my opinion was it's the brown stuff that my plants grow in. But what is it really to us as a gardener? So it's a biological universe. You've probably heard that in 1 teaspoon of soil, there is more life than there are humans on the planet, which is just mind-boggling. 1 teaspoon. And that biological universe below the ground, that subterranean biological universe, is helping us to have a healthier, happier, more beautiful garden, if that's our goal, which it is for me. So looking after that is really important. It's a nutrient store. So we know from our GCSE biology that the plants photosynthesize, they take the energy from the sun, converting it into sugars. That's all well and good, but they need more than that. So the soil itself is what's able to provide the rest of the nutrients, or most of the rest of the nutrients, to the plants. And that again comes back to this biological universe, breaking it down and creating it into compounds that can be taken up by the plant, and also through the mycorrhizal symbiosis, which Dr. Cowell will touch on later, providing nutrients in return for carbon-rich sugars. We have carbon capture, which comes partly from the plants pumping down those sugars, and it also comes from the roots being grown into the soil as well. So they're taking carbon from the atmosphere and putting it into the soil, which we're all conscious of nowadays with climate change and trying to reduce carbon, atmospheric carbon. And it is a climate buffer. So that is kind of linked, but it acts in times of severe climate change or climatic events such as heavy rain, droughts, high temperatures, low temperatures. We're seeing a lot more of that now, and soil can act as a buffer against some of that, almost as like a sponge. It can remove pollutants, which includes filtering water, and it can prevent floods, which again is something that is prevalent at the moment. We're seeing a lot of, And if we have well cared for, good structured soil, it can help to absorb more water, preventing runoff. So it's worth looking after. It's not just the brown stuff we grow our plants in. So back to building the garden, what do you do first? You do the hard stuff. You want to put in any of the hard landscaping first. So these are all just some of the ideas that you might need before you start planting plants and looking after the soil. Things like drainage and soakaways if it's a very boggy area and you want a dry garden, putting the electricity for lighting, for entertaining, seating, dining, all that kind of stuff. So here's my garden. Once I'd stripped back that lawn that you saw at the start, I've measured out, laid out where the paths were going to be with a hose pipe, and then worked a bit on the soil, but mostly put in paths. You can see in the middle of the slide there, you can see my little red thing, little red square is the riddle. I used that to sieve out all of the junk that was in my soil, and it took forever. You can also see here lots of pots of plants. So those pots are being readied for planting up. And it's at this stage, once you've prepared your soil, that you can start thinking about planting out. So you want to lay out your pots, get your measurements right, take a step back, move in, shuffle them around. Ideally, from a garden designer's perspective, you want to be putting plants in odd numbers, so groups of 3, 5, 7. It's just more appealing on the eye. And you also want to be repeating patterns if possible. It's a good way of creating like a depth perspective. In terms of time of year to plant out, ideally April or September at best. That's because the soil is warm enough for the roots to be growing and for the plants to be growing, and also it's not too hot or too extreme a temperature if it's the winter for the plants to suffer and struggle. So April and September ideal for planting out. There's some of the pot plants, and that's them in the ground. This is a quick time lapse of some of the work that I did just to give you an idea of how it takes shape. It's also a good example of how good herbaceous perennials are for creating an established garden very quickly. You can see the border on the left, that was only planted earlier that year, and already it's full floral and a bit wacky, but that's my style. The middle section I've not yet dealt with, which is why it looks almost like a grave. But then as the seasons go on, working through the soil, you can see me using the riddle once again. And as I said, it's incredible the amount of growth that a herbaceous perennial can put on in one season. It never ceases to amaze me after it dies back in the winter and then pumps out all this growth. It's incredible. And you can see in the top right there, that area of the garden is where I've put in some gravel into the soil. So they are more drought-loving plants. And I tried to do that to create almost like a soft border into the rest of the garden. So I've tried to put in things like Mediterranean shrubs. And by adding the gravel in, it made the soil more free draining. And it meant it was a more natural aesthetic following on from a gravel drive into the garden, rather than it being straight into just the blousy herbaceous perennials. Now this is, as the time's gone on a little bit, we are still in the same year, but we're moving into autumn. And you can see all the flowers have died back, but it's the middle section that I just want you to look at for a second there. That is a green manure that I put in. I realized I didn't have time to put in all the plants I wanted to do, but I wanted to protect the soil. Now I could have done that by mulching with compost, something like that, but I decided to put in Phycelia tenacetifolia, which is one of many options of green mulches. I chose that one because it has a nice flower, but it means that there are roots in the ground, which means you're feeding down some of the carbon into the soil still, and it also protects from erosion. So I did that over the winter, and then when we got in spring, I dug it into the soil and carried on planting up. So you can see the herbaceous perennial starting to pop through again now, putting on some good growth into May, and then probably at that peak in, I think it's about early June. And then in summer, it goes a bit bonkers, a bit of a wacky look. But the general feeling for my gardens, and I've probably said herbaceous perennials about 100 times now, but is to go for this sort of cottage scheme and have a wild, wacky floral extravaganza. So you've got your garden of your dreams, and all you need to do now is maintain. But I have a work-pleasure balance. I think that too long can be spent trying to be the master of your domain, and I try and find cheats, try and find easy ways around that. And I have found that mulching and growing herbaceous perennials are two of the best ways at actually reducing the amount of time you have to put into your garden. So I spend longer on my lawn that I still have. I have an area of lawn. I spend longer on that every year than I do on that whole flower bed. And that's because I don't need to water. After the first year, when I did have to water things in until it became established, I no longer have to water because I don't disturb the soil, and I apply a mulch every year. And it means that the plants have got deep roots and they've got a lot of organic matter in the soil that's helping to hold in the water, and they've got access to that in times of need. I don't really need to weed. It's very rare, which is quite surprising to some people. But the beauty of this kind of plant, if you plant densely with these perennials, it means that there's very little area for the weeds to grow. And also, if you're not digging, you're not disturbing the soil, and weeds thrive in disturbed soil. So I don't have to weed very much either. And finally, pests. Now, one thing I noticed when I first created the garden, I went overboard on the feed with the natural feed, so the manure, and it meant I created very leggy plants. And at the same time, I created this massive trauma in the soil and in the garden in general, and it allowed an infiltration of pests. So for the first year, it was a nightmare, and it took a leap of faith not to get too involved. I don't use any chemicals, any fertilizers or any pesticides or herbicides. I let the garden do its thing. I had to consider what part I wanted to play in that, and sit on my hands sometimes in terms of not being too involved, because the more involved you are at the start, the more involved you're going to have to be forever. You're inserting yourself into that circle of life where suddenly you are one of the predators when you don't need to be. You need to trust in nature and let it find its balance. So I was able to do that, and now I have no pest problems at all. Well, there's no perfect life where there isn't a single snail, a single slug, and a single aphid. They exist, but their predators find a balance, and the damage is minimal. And most of what I've said there comes down to mulching. So the benefits of mulching, which we touched on, I want to talk about at the start. It aids water retention and reduces evaporation. It smothers annual weed seedlings, meaning I don't need to weed so often. It feeds the soil biota, meaning that I have healthy subterranean life, and that helps to give healthier plants. Top dressing, it looks good, but it also improves the soil aeration, reducing compaction. The worms and other life take the organic matter down into the soil. It eliminates erosion, meaning we're not losing our precious topsoil. And it reduces carbon release, which can be associated with tilling and digging. When that soil is exposed to the earth, you can lose carbon into carbon dioxide. So by mulching and letting nature do its thing, working it into the soil itself, that helps to retain the carbon in the soil too. So in summary, all of that, my time is now up. I hope you understand that you can create a beautiful garden with maybe a little bit of hard work at the start, but low ongoing maintenance as long as you mulch. And that's that.
Thank you so much, John. That was so interesting. And I am never going to listen to the Baz Luhrmann song again in the same way. Thank you. We'll be taking questions for John along with our other speaker at the end of today's session. Our next speaker is Dr. Jill Cowell. Jill's an active researcher at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in fungal plant interactions. Jill originally trained as a horticulturalist, where she became fascinated by the role of Mycorrhizal fungi in cultivated gardens, and she is currently studying that in semi-natural habitats, including heathlands, woodlands and grasslands. Jill has qualifications from the Royal Horticultural Society, an MSc in plant diversity from the University of Reading, and was awarded a PhD in biological sciences from Imperial College London in 2016. And I'd just like to say over to you, Jill.
Thank you very much. I will be right there. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Fantastic. Okay, can you see my screen?
I can't see that yet.
Okay, let me know when you can.
Oh, there it is. Yep, there it is. We've got it.
Fantastic. And it's just the main screen and not all of the slides following, yes?
That's right. It's just your presenter mode, so just the main screen.
Okay. Well, let's go then. Hi, everybody, and thank you for coming. Today, my aim is really to provide you with an X-ray view of mycorrhizal fungi in our soils and practical ways to use this knowledge in your own gardens and fields, and really to demystify what are these mycorrhizal fungi. So when we're walking through a semi-natural woodland, most people see trees and leaves on the ground, and if you're lucky, you'll see some of these fungi and fruiting bodies, which in this case happen to be edible. But in my mind's eye, I see these mycorrhizal fungi below ground. So myco for fungi and rhiza for roots. This is a mutualism. This is an ecological interaction between two species where each receives a benefit. And as you can see, in this case, the Boletus edulis, it associates mainly with evergreens, but it also associates with broadleaf trees, oaks and beech and birch. And the Lactarius also associates with Cistaceae, a family which we'll see in a moment. So today I'm going to provide an extremely rapid overview of mycorrhizal fungi from an evolutionary biology and ecological perspective. And then we're going to apply this practically in the second half of the talk when we delve into hort ecology. So very briefly, we're going to look at the evolution of this fungus plant mutualism, the different mycorrhizal types, their functions, this communication network or wood wide web that we hear a lot about, and then again, practical applications for your gardens. So, and I'm going to talk you through this. So I know it's a little difficult to read, but hopefully it will be useful when you enter your gardens to think about this in the background. So this is a land plant phylogeny, and it shows the land plant lineages, starting with the basal bryophytes and up to your tracheophytes, gymnosperms and angiosperms. And then you see these little colored circles, which are the associating mycorrhizal fungal guilds. And across the fungal types, there are different fungi that associate with different plants. And then you can see at the top your modern garden plants, the angiosperms and gymnosperms, associate with all four guilds that trace back to the early bryophytes. So there are two main lifestyles or colonization strategies. They're the ectos or Ectomycorrhiza and the Endomycorrhiza. The ectos are external. You can see the blue mycelium forms this mantle around the root. And then the Endomycorrhizas actually enter the cells, the cell walls. And this is where the interface occurs, the interface of nutrients in the case of the Endomycorrhizal fungi. Now, the ectos are the ones that produce fruiting bodies, and the endos do not produce fruiting bodies. What you see here is a root that was cleared and stained with ink, and you see hyphae. Those are the mycorrhizal fungi inside. Incidentally, that's a Lycopodiella. So the ectos may only colonize 2% of the plants that are named, but they're very important woody plants that dominate our temperate and boreal forest. This includes Pinaceae and birch and beech and oaks. And they're thought to be over 20,000 fungal species that are in this group. And you can see in the picture on the bottom what they look like. This is about 10 times magnified. It looks like this little sheath covering the roots, and then to the very right you see a close-up of all of these hyphae. Then the Endomycorrhizas, the ones that enter the cells, they actually are hosted by most of our garden plants. So about 80% of our plants engage and host these symbionts. And they're also sometimes known as arbuscular mycorrhizas, although not all of them form arbuscules, but you can see where the name comes from in the bottom right here. This hyphae form this sort of tree-like structure. And there are about 300 to 1,600 known species of this group. And then there's also a similar physical interface that happens with 2 other plant families, but they're highly specialized fungi that have evolved with the Orchidaceae family and the Ericaceae family. And you can see in the case of the Ericaceae, the ericoid mycorrhizas, they form these little coils inside the cells. And that's a heather root you're looking at. And incidentally, as Ben mentioned in the introduction, we're working now on a heathland looking at nitrogen deposition, long-term effects of nitrogen deposition, and the impact on these ericoid mycorrhizal fungi. And that's at Thursley Common in Surrey. Moving on. So we know that the leaves make sugars, which are transferred to the mycorrhizal fungi, and in exchange, they assist with the nutrient acquisition, mainly the macronutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. We also see them aid in the micronutrient acquisition, water uptake. They really do provide stress buffers, but toxins in the soil, drought, and flooding, which we're going to see in just a moment. They help stabilize the soil, and they're a very significant player in carbon sequestration. So here's a hypothetical plant community showing how the hyphal networks exchange nutrients below ground. And if you can look closely at the pink and orange networks below ground, you can see on the left what's meant to be a parent conifer and its little sapling in the middle. And the pink and orange are connecting mother plant to seedling. We also see in this little community some of the endomycorrhizal plants, which are the herbaceous plants, not associating with above ground fruiting bodies. And to the very right, we see our orchid, which is kind of on its own with its evolutionary connections to a totally different fungal group. And this is developed further by Suzanne Simard in her work in Canadian forests. And I was informed today, just as an aside, by a friend who's not involved with the gardening world, that she was on Women's Hour today, talking about her work. So it's quite ironic that here we are presenting it today. And her work really is astonishing. What she's done using nitrogen-15 isotopes and DNA tracing, and she's actually pulled up the forest floor, and what you see on the bottom left are the soil and fungal mycelium that she traces from the mother or hub trees to the seedlings. And in her experiments, she's found that the hubs, they have the biggest, oldest trees are the ones that are most linked throughout the forest. In one experiment, she planted the seeds from the mother randomly alongside seeds from the same species, but from other forests. So these were implants from another forest. And she found that the mother trees actually recognize their own seeds versus the transplants in terms of the nutrients that were traced. And this was all measured up. And the seedlings of the daughter seedlings survived 4 times as much as the foreigners. So using this shared hyphal community concept, I ran nursery experiments to test the efficacy of using fungi from one plant to fertilize another plant. And so this was applied in a heathland restoration project, although the experiments themselves were first done in the nursery. So here we have the heather and leafy liverworts, and they cohabitate above ground. And below ground, on the left, you see a heather root system with the mycorrhizal fungi and the leafy liverwort rhizoid, which is packed with fungi. And actually, they have the same ericoid mycorrhizal fungi. So this was verified using molecular techniques. And with this knowledge, we isolated the fungus from the wild liverworts. And then we resynthesize this fungus back into axenically grown liverworts. And then we took both of these different fertilizers, biological fertilizers, and we sprinkled them about on hundreds of heather cuttings in the nursery, and it was Erica tetralix and Kaluna. And then I inundated them for 21 days. And what I found was that the heathers that were treated with either the fungus or the colonized liverworts were significantly better survivors than the controls. So in fact, it really was a viable stress regulator for flooding. And now we're going to move into the horde ecology section of the talk. So just thinking about your garden wisdom, regardless of one's background or whether you have a garden or you've been observing nature in parklands or fields, whether you're age 5 or 85, most of us recognize a rose from a cactus or a blade of grass. And we appreciate that they all have different needs. And so these are just some random thoughts that I had about what we do recognize and take for granted. We know there are different species. As amateur gardeners, we understand drainage and water and pH preferences. We know we need to keep a tidy garden by pruning, possibly. There are climate variables, phenological events, pollinators, and pests and diseases. We know so much less, though, about what the below ground microbiota requires. We do understand soil structure is important, as you just heard from John, and the microfauna community and nutrients. But what about the most important plant partners, our mycorrhizal fungi? The remainder of the talk, I'm going to talk about how we can use the knowledge from our understanding of evolutionary biology and some ecological concepts and apply them to your own garden scheme or your fields. So I'm not a garden designer, as you can see, but here's a view of a simple random perennial garden planting scheme. And I've decided to simplify it and just plant 7 species. Okay, so we have the Magnolia cuensis, I couldn't resist, Trachyospermum, Erysimum acistis, Perovskia, Chionodoxa, and let's not forget that the grass itself contains several different species. And now we're going to look below ground and see the associating mycorrhizal fungal guilds. So firstly, most of the plants are these endomycorrhizal associations, but different fungi with different plants, not all of them will associate with the same plants. Remember, we have something like 300 to 1,000 plus different known species of endomycorrhizas. So firstly, a few notes. The magnolia, you see, associates with the endomycorrhizal fungi, but you might have thought that would be ecto because it's a tree, but actually in this case, because it's an early diverging flowering plant, it's still holding on to the more ancient endomycorrhizal group. What about Brassicaceae? So this family is non-mycorrhizal. We don't have enough time to go into that today, but it's not, as far as we know at this stage. And then I've listed a few other families that are not mycorrhizal, the Crassulaceae, Proteaceae, and Orobanchaceae. And then Cystaceae is ecto, in fact, often associates with edible Ectomycorrhizas. So, okay, some of these plants will be working together, some of them won't. Remember, we have competition above ground, but we also have competition going on below ground for these resources. And let's say the magnolia dies and we decide to plant a rhododendron. So now we have an Ericaceae plant, which relies on ericoid mycorrhizas, but the turf and almost everything else is our Muscular Mycorrhiza. So that's not really going to do the Ericaceae plant any good. So it's just something to think about as you start planning out your garden. What kind of community are you creating? What kind of networks can you facilitate? And in terms of facilitating, do we or don't we use these products that we see in the garden shops? So I get asked this question a lot. And knowing what you now know about evolutionary biology and these 450 million-year-old association, I am leaning towards, well, there may be some that can do some good, but I think nature has evolved in such a way that it's quite complex. And if we are going to do it, I suggest that you test out the product with a particular plant and compost before you just use it throughout the garden. Because remember, everything you do above ground affects the below ground. But I'm going to look with you now at a few studies which go into detail on this question. So this research group last year reviewed 68 fungal inoculation products. And they found that most of them, you can see 34%, had only one taxa, one mycorrhizal taxa. Only a handful use 5 or more. And as you now know, there are over 300 different species out there. So whether they're the right ones, whether they're viable, and incidentally, most of them in these packages are Muscular Mycorrhizal fungi. So they claim to help trees, but they're not going to be helping oaks, or, well, oaks are a funny one because sometimes in their early years they associate with AM, but they won't be helping birches and pines and many other trees, or most trees. So it's just something to keep in mind. You need to know which tree is associating with the Ectomycorrhizas versus the endo, know what's in your pack. And to that end, many of these packs have more than just mycorrhizal fungi. They have different fertilizers. And as John mentioned, if you're doing a Mediterranean garden, you don't want to fertilize. So let the fungi do the work for you. This study looked at 4 Muscular Mycorrhizal tree species, and then they harvested them at 3 different intervals. And they found, first of all, these graphs, I know they're a little difficult to read, but the black spots are control and the hollow circles are the treated plants. And in all 4 cases, the root length was suppressed, and the inoculants had no effect on mycorrhizal colonization or shoot growth. And one last study that was done at Sheffield recently, University of Sheffield, they tested 3-week cultivars using a highly sophisticated lab setup. They used isotopes to trace the nutrients and measure whether there was any exchange going on. And they had varied outcomes, but mainly the above ground biomass wasn't different between the control and the treated, represented in the minus and plus signs on the x-axis. And they did see some differences in the below ground biomass. There was higher phosphorus content in the leaves, but it wasn't related to the mycorrhizal fungi, and there was no nitrogen benefit. And one last point on factors affecting spore population. Mainly, this study found that pH was very important, water content, but interestingly, also the rhizosphere depth. So as you go further down in the soil, you lose spores. The vast majority were found in the top 10 centimeters, and then gradually reduced as they went down. So important to keep in mind when we start going on to some practical applications. So here you have Q's Palm House Parterre. This is a very labor-intensive endeavor. I think they redo the beds 3 times a year. And when they do that, they dig 2 spits deep, they turn the soil, they're aerating it, etc. But knowing what you now know, perhaps the best thing to do is to skim off the top, save the top 10 to 20 centimeters on boards, and then when you backfill, make sure you keep those on top so the new plants have access to the fungal propagules right away. Another thing I noticed walking around the garden. So this is Q's grass garden. In the back, you can see all the grasses were cut down in the autumn after they flowered. And they completely removed this bed. And in doing that, I mean, there's absolutely nothing there. So they dug it all out, they turned it over. Why not keep, say, 3 of the grasses that were there for years and as sort of mini hubs? So you're maintaining this mycorrhizal network, and then the new plants that go in can benefit from the already existing arbuscular mycorrhizas that are there. Because think about it, I mean, there are a long distance for new plants to have to travel to rebuild these bridges. It is really like having railroad tracks there. And so let's facilitate these connections as much as possible. And finally, what to do with these common fungal pests that we see around our garden. Now, if you're not presenting at Chelsea or any other competition, my advice is to just live with it. Sure, there are little blemishes here, but we all have blemishes. I mean, the alternative, people use these products, and I go back to what we do above ground affects below ground. So with that, I'm going to summarize some of the practical tips of the talk. So firstly, use these mycorrhizal networks to your advantage. Remember how they can cooperate and compete with one another. Avoid adding nutrients and fungicides. Let the mycorrhizal fungi work for you. Decrease digging. Maintain garden hubs regardless of the scale. So you can use this Simard concept of mother tree even with a little patch of grass. And use caution when applying the commercial products. Test them out first in a pot, not one size fits all. And remember the wider ecological benefit of these fungi in our soil as a tremendous carbon sink. And finally, what we do above ground impacts below ground, and whatever we do below ground impacts above ground. And I'll just leave you with this lovely thought that's several hundred years old. And references available upon request. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was absolutely fascinating. And we're just going to invite Ben Sykes back from ECT, who has been monitoring the questions, and I'm sure he has some to ask both of you. Before you get into that, Ben, I have a question of my own for Jill, which I hope you don't mind me using my chair's privilege and crashing in. But you talked a little bit there about keeping some examples of plants so that those networks can be maintained even if you have a clear patch of ground. I am an avid allotment holder, and obviously I have one set of crops goes in, and then I might have a period of a month or two between crops and between cover cropping. Have you got any suggestions for what I could do or other allotment holders could do in the meantime to avoid that situation?
Well, you can have a little tree in the corner that you don't touch, right? And perhaps select a tree which uses that associates with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So you're more likely to have those networks running underneath in your garden. And bear in mind again this idea that the top 10 centimeters have the majority of the propagules. And so when you do rebed and turn over, keep that on the side and then put it back in. Yeah, put it back on top.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks very much, Jill. I'll hand over to you, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, John, and thank you, Jill. We have just under 5 minutes to squeeze some questions in. First, a couple from Christian Murray, and one of which is aimed at both of you, really. Firstly, John, have you ever used soil flocculants? And slightly different context for Jill, have you looked in your research at soil flocculants and mycorrhizal fungi? So John first.
Okay, so in short, no, no, not really. No, in terms of the mycorrhizal associations, I was speaking with Dr. Cowell before we did the talk, and I did try to use one product to form the mycorrhizal symbiosis, but it was what Dr. Cowell covered in her talk there, and I didn't see a difference in what I planted between what I planted and what was growing elsewhere in the garden in terms of how well it established. So that answers that part of the question.
Jill?
Yeah, so I highlighted one of the experiments I did, but it wasn't with a commercial product. I used these liverworts, which cohabitate with the heathers in the wild. And so I'm an advocate for using the same cohabitating species to help one another, rather than possibly introducing new fungal strains into your garden.
Okay, thank you both. A follow-up from Christian Murray on that is for John. John, would you say you have a similar philosophy to permaculture process, if you're familiar with that?
Yes, yeah, I do. I do believe in the idea of trying to allow nature to do its thing in terms of allowing the processes beneath the ground to benefit the plants above the ground. I've dabbled in permaculture myself. I do have the veg patch at the back of the garden as well. But to be honest, I'm slightly more traditional, so I'm still learning a lot about that. I'm more focused on the floral side of things. So I guess you can translate some of those across. I think permaculture generally fits more in with the edible side of things, but there are certainly some areas of that translates across to the flower garden too.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Laura Chan about beginner's guides, and this relates to a question I was going to ask as moderator about how much, Jill, we know about which plants have mycorrhizal capability and which don't, and therefore which John might choose for his garden. And Laura says, are there any beginner guides on plant families that support mycorrhizae? And do you get this information on plants when you buy them from the garden centre, or is it difficult to find?
I think the garden centers and the commercial world have not yet evolved to include this on the labels. I haven't seen it on any labels. In terms of beginners references, we do know which families associate with which of the major guilds, and there's a lot of research, particularly on agricultural crops, on which particular genus of fungus associates with a particular plant. This information is accessible online. I've seen a couple of guides. There's one scholar, Brundrit, he has a website and it lists which families are mycorrhizal with which major type of fungus. And there are countless, of course, academically oriented papers that do this. But I'm happy, if you want to email me, I can send you some of these links, and that can help you. It's out there, yeah.
Okay, thank you both. I think, unfortunately, we're out of time. There may be a route to exploring the additional questions with BSS members outside this software, but it's my pleasure to hand back to Sarah for the closing formalities.
That's super. Thank you, Ben. And of course, if you have any follow-ups, Jill and John, that you'd like to share with our members, we'd be happy to do that on your behalf. So I'd just like to end by, on behalf of the British Society of Soil Science, thanking you all for attending, and also thanking John and Jill for coming along to present today, and to Ben for hosting our Q&A session. You will find a quick feedback survey when you leave this webinar, which we hope you'll take the time to complete to help us improve and continue to develop our seminars each month. The recording of this event will also be available on our YouTube channel post-event, and you will receive an email from us with the link to that in the next day or two. Our next Zoom into Soil session, as I said earlier, will take place on Wednesday, the 6th of April, and is now open for registration on our website. So there's nothing further for me to say other than thank you again for attending today, and we hope to see you at future events. Thank you and goodbye.